Hello, everyone. I'm Lucy, and today I'd like to take you, as Joh said, on a brief venture into the vocabulary of viral variation. This is a story about communication during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been the focus of my honours research at ANU. But the story really starts before the pandemic even began. Back in 2018, I signed up for an elective called Traditional Grammar. And as you can see from the textbook here, it was an introduction to ancient Greek and Latin. I didn't know it then, but something I learned in that course was about to become very relevant on a global scale. In 2020, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic brought about a lot of change to our world. This included change to our language, so much so that the Oxford English Dictionary published 2 special updates highlighting the terminology that was starting to circulate around the world. In the second special update, the editor said that the impact of COVID-19 on our lives and our language is an ongoing story. As we learn more about the nature of the virus, the associated vocabulary changes, and the terms themselves change in meaning and usage. This quote described the situation at the time, but it also describes a situation to come. Because all too soon, variants of the virus that causes COVID-19 started to emerge. As these variants spread around the world, so did names for them, and controversial ones at that. A range of different people, from researchers to journalists, started to raise concerns. They said that scientific names were complicated and more relevant to phylogenetics geeks, while names that reference certain countries could be stigmatizing. So what was there to do? The World Health Organization brought together a group of experts to deliberate and ultimately decide on a new naming system. On a Monday in May 2021, almost 15 months into the pandemic, the WHO announced a new naming system for variants, using letters of the Greek alphabet. I remember them. By this new system, what had been known as the UK variant, or B117, was now to be called the Alpha variant, and the so-called Indian variant should now be called the Delta variant. These letter names were specifically recommended for use by national authorities and media outlets. But some people suspected that uptake wouldn't be simple. And we didn't know how variants were being discussed in the first place, let alone how that name change would play out. There were, however, a few hints in the literature. News media has been blamed for spreading misinformation and stigmatizing messages. And it's also well documented that specialist terminology, sometimes known as jargon, can cause issues in communication. As for concerns about stigmatization, names referencing geographic locations have a well-established place in the history of infectious disease, from the Spanish flu of 1918 to the so-called China virus of 2020. Specific to that last example, one study looked at what happened when the WHO introduced the official name COVID-19 for the disease caused by this China virus. They found that after the announcement of the new name, potentially stigmatizing names almost disappeared. This suggests that renaming variants, which have geographic names, might be possible too. But there hadn't been any similar studies looking into it. Beyond the names being used in communication, there are also frames to think about. Not this kind of frame, of course, but more conceptual ones. In news coverage in general, and specific to science topics, things like responsibility and accountability can get particular emphasis when information is being shared with the world. But although there has been some research on framing during the pandemic, like this study here, there was a lack of studies specific to variants, let alone in the context of a name change. So there was an opportunity to look at the names and frames characterizing communication about SARS-CoV-2 variants, and more specifically ask the question, of how variants were being named and framed before and after the new naming system was introduced. Now, there are many ways to study the nature of communication, but I wanted to focus in on these specific aspects of names and frames. In this case, quantitative content analysis provided a way to systematically explore and document the presence of certain words and language patterns. In practice, there were three main stages of that process. First, identifying the articles that I was going to study. Using the Factiva database, I identified search terms that would help draw out relevant articles. Then I narrowed down the scope to Australia for practicality's sake and applied a database filter covering all the major print newspapers around the country. For the timeframe of the study, I focused in on the time surrounding the announcement of the new naming system, and more specifically, from 3 weeks before to 3 weeks after. With all these criteria in place, I had 106 articles to work with. The next step was deciding on the characteristics I was going to look for in each article. And this process was iterative and cumulative, and ultimately helped me develop a coding scheme. This coding scheme covered general characteristics, naming patterns related to variants, and framing patterns as well. Once I had that provisional coding scheme in place, I started on the process of data collection. I coded all the articles following that coding scheme, assessed the reliability of that process, and then made some refinements to the coding scheme as well. I coded the full set of articles one more time, and then it was time for data analysis. To analyze the data, I started with descriptive statistics, looking at frequency distributions of characteristics I had coded for. Then, to go a little bit deeper, I tested the association between different variables using the chi-square test of independence. So that brings us to my results. Looking at variant naming first, it helps to remember why the WHO introduced this Greek letter labeling system in the first place. They said that there were issues with using technical scientific names and with people resorting to the use of country names. So what can we say about how often these names were being used before the intervention and after? In May, to start with, both alphanumeric names and geographic names were being used, but one a lot more than the other, geographic names. These country names also occurred in two different forms, unqualified and qualified. In the way that I coded it, names used normally were unqualified, whereas names modified, like these two in grey, were qualified. Now, if we compare the frequency of different naming systems between May and June, you can see how Greek letter names displaced the others. This shows us there was some uptake, and there was a significant difference in how often alphanumeric names and unqualified geographic names were being used between May and June. These naming patterns can also be broken down by media company, where you can see that articles from Australian community media only ever use Greek letter names. In contrast, Fairfax and News Corp articles took these Greek letter names on board, but to different extents, and they also continued to use non-recommended names. So that's a brief look at how variants were being named, but what about how they were being framed? Throughout these newspaper articles, there were specific references to variants history outside Australia. That is, references to where these variants might have come from or first been detected. For example, an article might, in a more neutral way, refer to the beta COVID-19 variant first identified in South Africa, or in a potentially more implicating way, describe the India origin Delta variant. Now, the frequency of references like these did decline over time, and there was a significant decline in the frequency of implicating references from May to June, but some still persisted. And if we look closer at the implicating references that did persist and the media companies involved, that decline only occurred in articles from News Corp publications. Now that was a very brief summary of my results, but what might the implications of them be? In one sense, the intentions of the WHO have been realized. They were encouraging adoption of Greek letter names instead of alphanumeric and geographic names. And at least amongst the articles that I looked at, we can see that this happened. In the context of previous research, this is consistent with uptake of a new name when swine flu was officially renamed back in 2009, and when COVID-19 was given its official name at the start of the pandemic. But geographic names especially continued to be used interchangeably with other names, as you can see in the examples here. This finding might be influenced by the limited time frame of the study, but it also suggests there was some truth to early doubts about uptake. If these patterns are maintained on a longer term, it would really show how difficult it can be to change established practice. And this might also have flow-on implications for that ultimate goal of destigmatization. On the topic of stigma, there's also the matter of the Wuhan strain. This geographic name continued to be used, but not instead of a Greek letter name, because it never got one. The WHO did suggest calling it the index strain, but this didn't flow through. And I think there is a valuable lesson here about the risks of unforeseen consequences. As for framing, in previous research, there wasn't a big difference in how News Corp and Fairfax papers assigned blame in relation to the pandemic. But in this study, the frequency of implicating references to variant history wasn't consistent across media companies. There were more in Fairfax articles like this one. I couldn't dig into the details too much within the scope of the study, but this could be due to the increasing polarization of the two companies. So now, what can we say about variants, renaming efforts, and the future of the Greek alphabet? For one thing, we can see how the impact of the pandemic on language is an ongoing story, to this day, as the editor of the Oxford Dictionary put it back in 2020. Communication about variants did change following WHO recommendations, but there were also nuances to that change, from the names being used to identify variants to the language surrounding those names. These variations could in turn influence outcomes. Intended effects could be emphasized, but maybe also compromised. So there are a few different directions for future research. Looking into the communication between different media companies in more detail, looking at flow-on effects, especially in terms of stigmatization, and looking at what people actually make of technical scientific names when they come up in communication beyond the virology lab. As for where the study leaves us today, we have a snapshot of early name change patterns. And this could become a valuable comparison point because the naming of diseases and their viral causes continues to evolve. There is, for example, the Omicron variant with its alphanumerically named subvariants. And then there's what you might know at the moment as monkeypox. In just the last few months, this name and the scientific names of its variants have also raised concerns. Now new names are being proposed, and you can even submit a suggestion yourself. But while we wait for the WHO to deliberate again, this situation of renaming in the making shows how relevant and important it is to understand naming patterns and responses to change. My research shows that new names can be taken up within a fairly short space of time to create headlines like these. But there are also nuances worth considering in deliberations on new names and replacement names. From oversights like the Wuhan strain to variations in naming and framing between media companies. At the end of the day, Only time and more research will tell us what happens when we're introduced to monkeypox's new name, or perhaps the Pi variant of SARS-CoV-2. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
Amazing. Can we give Lucy a round of applause, a Zoom applause? That was incredible. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was incredibly interesting. I just wanted to remind everybody as well to ask questions, and I'm sure you've got many, to chuck them just down in the chat for me, and I will relay those questions. But I actually have one to start off with, Lucy, if that's okay. Was it really 15 months before we adopted the Greek alphabet naming conventions? Because I don't know, maybe lockdown is all just like, you know, melding into one time frame and it's all wibbly wobbly, but it seemed like that happened pretty quickly, you know?
So that 15 months is from the start of the pandemic. We didn't actually start to know that, start to kind of recognize variants of the, I guess, index strain until about November 2020. So, you know, it was really, I guess, the first half of 2021 where it was kind of evolving.
Yeah, it feels a lot shorter, doesn't it? It's really interesting. I have to admit, I am listening to this talk as a former chemist. So I may not be, this might be a question that a lot of people in the audience already know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because who knows? And questions are good. Could you explain what coding means in the context that you were talking about?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that was definitely something that I had to wrap my head around as well. And it's not the kind of technical computer coding that you might have heard about. It's, I guess if you think about, you have a paragraph of text and it has singular words and then certain phrases as well. And then there are specific ways those words are arranged that are kind of different. So for example, the names of COVID variants or SARS-CoV-2 variants, there were geographic names and alphanumeric names and the Greek letter names. So if it was a Greek letter name, that was the Greek letter code, or it was just kind of a label really. And then there was a different label if it was an alphanumeric name.
Right. So it just kind of helps you pick out. Yeah. So
Yeah.
It helps you kind of pick out where all of the mentions are happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Oh, Joanna's got a question for you. So any ideas as to why newspapers weren't taking on the Greek letters? So was it harder to write the Greek letters out, or was it anything to do with, you know, the jargon and making it relatable to general population? So less sciencey kind of speak. So Joanna, just to clarify, did you mean any ideas as to why newspapers weren't taking on the Greek letters before the 31st or after, like in the kind of Volcanolostos, a little bit of both? Cool.
Okay, so the Greek letter names were only introduced on the 31st, so you couldn't really expect that they would be beforehand, but that was kind of why I wanted to start my time frame beforehand, so I had a comparison point. And I think because it was very early, kind of in the introduction period, sometimes it was they kept up using the other names because, well, from what I made of it, they kept up using the other names so that people would know that it was you know, the same variant, but it had a different name rather than as like a whole new variant in and of itself. But yeah, it's kind of interpretation on my part as much as, you know, I couldn't go and interview the journalists in this case, but that might be an interesting way to look at it as well.
Yeah, so Tom's got a question for you. How does it work in a journalistic structure? So things like who, what, when, where, why. Is this why people keep wanting to reference a location rather than a letter, do you think?
I think that's a good point. It's definitely, yeah, kind of having some location does give more detail and context when you're trying to describe an event that's happening. But I think in that case, there's also, there's different ways to describe or to identify a location. You can say, oh, well, it was, this variant was first detected somewhere, or, you could, depending on your reading of it or your writing of it, I guess, this variant was from here because, they were doing something that wasn't so good, or, there's some kind of implication in there as well, rather than, maybe they just had really consistent and comprehensive monitoring and, it was just bad luck,
I have one more question for you, unless anybody else has anything else that they want to ask as well. Type it down quickly in the chat. Do you think your results would change dramatically? And this is conjecture a lot, so I do apologize for that. But if you were able to extend the time frame, I understand like you've got specific kind of things that you're looking at, but if you extended the time frame a little bit more, do you think your results would change a little bit? Would there be a little bit more kind of a little bit more uptake, that kind of thing? Or
yeah, I think if I extending it, the time frame beyond those first 3 weeks, I mean, even just taking kind of community as discussion as a baseline, these Greek letter names have become fairly commonplace, and I guess it was interesting to kind of really dive into that transition period and see how it all played out. And I mean, now with Omicron and all its alphanumeric subvariants, I think that would add a whole new kind of chapter to it as well.
Yeah, you could probably research this for a very long time.
If you can bear it. Sometimes there's too much news about it.
Yeah, definitely. All right. And one more question for you. Are there recommendations from your research for future pandemics? Anything that you can kind of draw on? Hopefully there won't be a future pandemic, but
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's hard to, there's only so much that you can kind of anticipate, maybe with the Wuhan strain, for example, they couldn't necessarily predict whether there were going to be like slight limitations or loopholes in the strategy. But I think just in general, with this pattern of geographically naming diseases and viruses and things like that, maybe taking a step back and in the kind of preparation or preparedness efforts, thinking about, okay, so if something does come up, do we have a naming protocol or kind of set of recommendations that we can follow, so it doesn't just kind of automatically become this country name because it's convenient.
Yeah, I think that has very, very interesting implications. All right, we've unfortunately run out of time. Can we give Lucy one more massive round of Zoom applause? That was really well done. Thank you so much.